At 11:47 p.m. on Halloween night, every camera inside Florida's Dade Correctional Institution flickered and went black. For exactly 6 minutes, the entire maximum security block was swallowed by darkness. Guards shouted down corridors, alarms glitched, and the faint hum of the generator cut through the static like a heartbeat. When the lights returned, one cell stood open, and one man was gone. His name was Marcus Tillman, inmate number 4076, serving life without parole. But what unsettled investigators wasn't how he escaped. It was what the cameras recorded in the seconds before they failed. A shadow appeared behind Marcus, faint and distorted, moving against the light. It wasn't another inmate. It wasn't human. When technicians slowed the footage frame by frame, they saw something that froze them cold. A tall, indistinct figure standing inside the locked cell, its head turning just as the feed went dark. That was the last time anyone ever saw Marcus Tillman alive, or whatever it was that left Dade Correctional in his place. If you dare step deeper into the darkness, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. You'll need it. Outside, Halloween had been a chaotic affair. Costumed families roamed suburban streets, unaware that just a few miles north, the maximum security prison was brimming with tension and fear. Inside, the inmates were restless, some pacing the narrow corridors, others whispering tales of past incidents that happened on this same night. Guards moved in shadows, their radios crackling with static, trying to maintain control over a facility built for punishment, not festivity. It was a night when every sound was magnified, every movement a potential threat, and every dark corner might hide something that shouldn't exist. Detective Laura Mendel, a federal investigator specializing in high-risk escapes, had been called to Dade Correctional early the next morning. She recalled stepping into the facility and immediately sensing an unnatural chill. The walls, normally sterile and gray, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The smell of bleach and metal couldn't mask the faint, underlying odor of decay, or something else, something older. Laura had investigated hundreds of prison breaks in her career, but the reports from this one kept her awake at night. Something about Marcus Tillman's disappearance didn't add up. Surveillance tapes showed the chaos clearly. Marcus had been in his cell, behaving normally, talking quietly to his cellmate about an upcoming legal appeal. Then, in less than a minute, the lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness. The audio feed captured faint, unidentifiable whispers, or voices, echoing through the corridor. When the footage returned, the cell door was open, the bed undisturbed, and Marcus gone. No one else had been in the area. No alarms triggered during the blackout. It was as if the prison itself had swallowed him whole. Forensic teams combed the area the next day. They found nothing. No fingerprints beyond Marcus's, no footprints, no signs of tampering. Even the locks were intact, except for a single, subtle scratch on the cell's bolt, a mark too precise, almost deliberate. When officers discussed the incident in private, some whispered that the prison was alive that night, that the building itself had facilitated the escape. Others dismissed it as fantasy, until they reviewed the footage again and saw the figure behind Marcus. That figure became the focal point of the investigation. Analysts struggled to enhance the shadowy image. It appeared human in silhouette, yet its limbs stretched and bent unnaturally. Its presence didn't trigger motion sensors or alarms. Even more disturbing, when digital enhancement attempts were made, the figure seemed to flicker and vanish, reappearing only in fragments on certain frames. A few employees claimed they felt its presence that night, an oppressive energy crawling over their skin, a cold breath where there was no wind. One guard later described hearing Marcus's voice calling for help in the middle of the night, only to find the cell block empty. Interviews with inmates painted an equally unsettling picture. Marcus had been unusually nervous that week, talking about voices in the walls and someone watching. Some claimed the corridors whispered when no one was around, and that on Halloween, the prison felt different, not just tense, but aware. Inmates reported hearing chains dragging across empty floors, soft knocks on doors with no one outside, and a faint figure moving between shadows in the corner of their eyes. Many shrugged it off as paranoia. Prison plays tricks on the mind, after all. But after Marcus disappeared, the whispers gained weight, and the shadows seemed to follow everyone. Detective Mindle discovered a fragment of Marcus's personal notes, scribbled in a small journal recovered from his cell. Among mundane entries about legal appeals and family visits were chilling passages. I see them in the dark. They watch. I can feel their eyes through the walls. Halloween is coming. I am not ready. The handwriting grew erratic toward the final lines, with phrases scrawled over one another. They are here. They move with me. I must leave. It was as if Marcus had sensed something approaching, something tied to the date itself, something that didn't belong in the physical world. Nightly interviews with prison staff revealed a shared unease. Several officers admitted feeling an unexplainable pressure, a tightness in the chest, during the hours surrounding the blackout. Some heard doors slam without cause. Lights flickered even in rooms with no wiring issues. And every staff member agreed on one thing. Marcus had vanished in a way that no one could explain. The word supernatural was avoided at first, but as the days passed, it was whispered more frequently. Even the most skeptical officers were forced to confront the impossible. A local paranormal historian, Dr. Samuel Cruz, was brought in to examine the prison's history. Dade Correctional had a long record of violence and unrest, riots, murders, and unexplained deaths over decades. Cruz claimed that places soaked in fear and suffering could harbor residual energy, creating moments where reality itself bent. Buildings remember pain, he explained. And some nights, like Halloween, that memory reaches out and interacts with the living. His theory was dismissed by some as fringe, yet when Detective Mindle watched the tape with him, she could not shake the feeling that the shadow was more than a digital glitch. It was intentional, aware. On the morning after Halloween, the entire prison was placed on heightened alert. Roadblocks were set up in surrounding areas. Helicopters scanned nearby forests, and every known associate of Marcus was questioned. Despite the massive mobilization, there was no trace. No tracks in the sand, no tire marks in the parking lot, not a hint of where he could have gone. Yet cameras recorded faint traces, shadows lingering where there shouldn't be shadows, reflections that didn't belong to anyone, and whispers captured faintly in static-laced audio. Something had moved Marcus, or allowed him to move, in ways that defied all explanation. By the end of the first week, the story had gripped national headlines. Journalists described a Halloween escape too strange to believe, while online forums debated whether it was a high-level human scheme or an encounter with something beyond the natural world. Inmates whispered among themselves, exchanging theories about spirits and entities tied to the prison's violent history. Some believed that Marcus had been taken as part of a supernatural pact. Others suspected he had been helped by the shadows themselves, using the prison's infrastructure as a gateway. And then, just as investigators thought they might be reaching the limits of rationality, they revisited the final 10 seconds of the original footage. On the cell camera, frozen between frames, was the unmistakable shape of a face. Behind Marcus, watching, grinning. And it wasn't human. The footage haunted Detective Laura Mindle long after Halloween night. She couldn't shake the image of the shadow behind Marcus Tillman, nor the way it seemed to bend reality. The prison, once a place of cold metal and strict routine, now felt alive, aware of her presence. Returning with a small investigative team, cameras, and audio equipment, she was determined to capture whatever had taken Marcus, or revealed him to something else entirely. That night, the investigators walked slowly through the corridors Marcus had vanished from. Every step echoed unnaturally, lights flickering at random, shadows bent and stretched, shapes disappearing when looked at directly. Faint whispers, sometimes a man calling for help, other times laughter, echoed from walls that should have been silent. It was as if the prison itself was testing their fear, measuring how far it could push them. Audio recordings captured anomalies, distant footsteps pacing empty hallways, metallic scraping, and voices speaking in tones too low to be human. When enhanced, some whispers called Marcus's name. One in turn flinched as a shadow flickered in her peripheral vision and vanished before she could turn. Detective Mindle dug into Marcus's history. Each Halloween in prison, reports noted his panic attacks and claims of voices in the walls. Psychologists dismissed them as anxiety, but the synchronicity with his disappearance was too precise. Marcus had sensed something approaching, something tied to the date itself, something unnatural. Forgotten records revealed other inmates had vanished during Halloween over the decades. Officers had sometimes noted a dark shape moving against walls or whispers in unknown languages. Each note painted a pattern. The prison seemed to awaken every Halloween. That same week, items from Marcus's cell began disappearing. Notes and journal fragments were found in impossible locations. Security cameras showed no human movement. Some suspected the prison itself was interacting with them, testing their persistence or sending warnings. As the team delved deeper, reality blurred. Shadows seemed to follow them. Fleeting footage showed dark figures mirroring their movements. The faint sound of Marcus's voice echoed through empty hallways. By the third night, tensions broke. Two investigators reported hands brushing their shoulders despite being alone, and one swore she saw Marcus's face in a cell window, only for it to vanish seconds later. Then the first disappearance occurred. One tech vanished while reviewing footage alone in the control room. Security logs showed no movement. Doors were locked. Yet playback revealed a dark silhouette approaching him, enveloping him in shadow, and then nothing. Panic set in, but the prison's insidious rhythm continued, as if alive and aware of every step they took. As daylight returned, one final piece of footage emerged. For 1 second, the camera showed an empty hallway. Then a figure appeared, looking directly into the lens. It had Marcus's face, twisted and indistinct, eyes glowing faintly. Behind him stretched the same tall, distorted shadow from the blackout footage. Then the feed cut to black. The descent had begun, and what they had witnessed was only the beginning. The following morning, Detective Laura Mendel returned to Dade Correctional with a renewed sense of urgency. The shadow, the disappearances, and the unexplained phenomena had left the investigative team shaken, but Mendel knew the answers were hidden in the prison's past. If Marcus Tillman had vanished into something beyond reason, then the key to understanding the events of that Halloween night lay buried in decades of untold stories and forgotten horrors. She began with the archives. Dusty records and yellowed reports revealed a pattern that had escaped public attention. Over the last 50 years, every Halloween had coincided with incidents of unexplained inmate disappearances, bizarre injuries, and security malfunctions. Officers' reports described shadows moving independently, whispers in empty corridors, and the sudden vanishing of items and prisoners. Most of these documents had been quietly dismissed as errors or misreporting, but together they formed a chilling tapestry, one that painted the prison as more than a building. It was something alive, something patient, and something old. Interviews with retired guards added flesh to the skeleton of the archives. One man, now in his 70s, recalled the 1978 Halloween incident in vivid detail. "We were doing our rounds," he said, voice trembling, "and one of the cells was empty. No alarm had sounded, no locks tampered with. We looked through the cameras, and I swear I saw a tall figure leaning against the bars, just watching. The inmate never came back. Some of us didn't speak of it for years." Another guard added that odd occurrences had always been more pronounced in the maximum security wings, areas where the shadows seemed to linger longer, and the air grew inexplicably cold. Detective Mendel brought in Dr. Samuel Cruz, the paranormal historian, to examine the prison's original construction and history. Cruz's research revealed a dark lineage. The prison had been built on land previously owned by a private executioner's estate. Before the walls of Dade Correctional rose, locals reported strange rituals and unexplained deaths on the property, particularly near the northern wing where the most violent inmates were housed. Cruz suggested that the cumulative suffering, death, and violence over decades had created a residual energy, a sentient darkness that seemed to awaken on Halloween. As the team explored the oldest sections of the prison, they discovered remnants of past Halloween events, preserved in forgotten storage rooms. Old costumes, chains, and tattered documents detailing inmate pranks that had escalated into fights and injuries. In one abandoned office, they found a half-burned journal belonging to an inmate who had disappeared in 1985. The entries described shadows moving independently, voices calling his name, and figures standing at the edge of perception, unseen, yet undeniably present. Each page hinted at a malevolent presence feeding off fear and the prison's energy, intensifying during the night of October 31st. Paranormal activity escalated that night. Cameras and motion sensors captured strange anomalies, elongated shadows creeping along walls, objects moving against gravity, and faint whispers that seemed to form words in a language no one recognized. One of the techs recorded faint scratching noises behind walls, yet when the team checked, there was nothing. No hidden compartments, no rodents, no human presence. The prison itself seemed to taunt them, aware of every movement, every heartbeat. The psychological strain began to fracture the team. Sleep-deprived and haunted, some members experienced vivid hallucinations. Glimpses of Marcus trapped in cells that shouldn't exist, whispers of his voice echoing from impossible directions, and fleeting images of the tall, distorted shadow moving just at the edge of vision. Arguments broke out, tempers flared, and the line between reality and nightmare blurred. It became apparent that Dade Correctional was not only a physical prison, but also a psychological trap, feeding on fear and exploiting human perception. One night, as they reviewed recovered audio, a chilling confession surfaced. An inmate, long dead, had written about hearing whispers in the walls, being guided by a shadow to escape only to vanish completely. He described the entity as patient, omnipresent, and intelligent, capable of manipulating both time and space within the prison. Mendel realized with horror that Marcus's disappearance was not an isolated event. It was part of a recurring cycle, a pattern that had persisted for decades and would continue as long as the prison stood. The team attempted to retrace Marcus's last known movements. Every corridor they entered seemed to shift slightly, doors opening and closing behind them, shadows forming shapes that mimicked their own. Their instruments went haywire. Thermal cameras recorded cold pockets in the middle of hallways. Audio devices picked up whispers when no one spoke, and even flashlights flickered erratically. Each anomaly reinforced the terrifying realization. The prison was not just haunted, it was actively aware of them, learning and manipulating events in ways beyond comprehension. In a chilling turn, they discovered a hidden cell from the prison's earliest construction phase. Its walls were lined with carvings, symbols, names, and dates, some of which corresponded with prior Halloween incidents. The team noted that the carvings grew denser near the northern wing, the area where Marcus vanished. Crews theorized that the entity may have anchored itself to this location, a focal point of power where the prison's dark energy was strongest. That night, Detective Mendel heard the first direct whisper calling her name. She froze, heart pounding, as a shadow detached from a corner of the hallway and slithered toward her. It moved unnaturally, bending around walls, ignoring obstacles, and then vanished just before she could confront it. The team watched in horror as monitors recorded fleeting images of Marcus standing in empty hallways, eyes wide with terror, seemingly trapped in a liminal space between the living and the supernatural. By the end of Chapter 3, the team understood one terrifying fact. Dade Correctional was no ordinary prison. It was a conduit for a malevolent entity, a sentient darkness feeding on fear and human presence, particularly on Halloween night. Marcus Tillman's fate was no longer a matter of human investigation alone. They had stepped into a game far beyond their understanding, one where the stakes were life, death, and the unseen forces that moved behind locked doors. The shadows were watching, and the secrets of Dade were only beginning to unfold. The night was thick with an unnatural stillness as Detective Laura Mendel and the remaining team prepared to re-enter Dade Correctional. The prison's hallways seemed longer than memory allowed, shadows stretching unnaturally, and every flickering light cast shapes that weren't their own. The entity had grown bold, aware of their movements, and the investigators knew this Halloween it would not remain passive. "It's like the prison knows we're here," whispered one of the techs, voice barely audible over the echo of their footsteps. The floor seemed to shiver underfoot, a low vibration that ran through the soles of their shoes. Cameras picked up fleeting figures at the edge of their vision, shadows that mimicked their every move, slipping just out of focus, always watching, always patient. They decided to attempt a direct interaction with the shadow. Using EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and voice recordings, the team tried calling Marcus's name aloud, asking if he was still present. At first, nothing responded. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper echoed. "You shouldn't be here." The temperature plummeted, breath freezing midair. One investigator's flashlight went out, leaving only the sound of footsteps in the dark. The team froze, realizing that the entity had shifted the environment itself, manipulating both perception and reality. Meanwhile, artifacts and fragments of Marcus's belongings began appearing in new locations. His journal, long thought missing, was discovered atop a high ledge, inaccessible without climbing. Pages flipped open on their own, revealing messages written in Marcus's hand, yet altered with new, impossible entries. "They watch me. I am between worlds. You cannot leave." It became clear the entity could communicate through him, or through what remained of him, and perhaps it was learning to manipulate the living investigators as it had Marcus. As the night deepened, one of the remaining techs vanished without warning. She had been checking the security feeds in the control room, surrounded by humming monitors, when she simply disappeared. Footage showed her walking past the camera, then a dark figure materializing behind her, engulfing her in shadow. When the team rushed in, there was no trace, only the whisper of her name in the air and the faint hum of the monitors. Panic set in, but the team realized any attempt to flee might only draw the entity's attention further. Desperate for answers, Detective Mindel focused on the northern wing, the prison's oldest and most notorious section. Past inmates who had vanished there shared one common thread: encounters with a tall, distorted shadow figure and visions of impossible hallways. As they entered, the air became oppressive, and the walls seemed to pulse. Cameras captured distortions in space, hallways bending at angles that defied architecture, doors opening into empty voids, and lights flickering in rhythms too precise to be accidental. Dr. Samuel Cruz examined carvings and symbols etched into the walls. Many corresponded to prior disappearances, forming a pattern that seemed to mark ritualistic significance. Cruz suggested that the entity might be a sentient echo of accumulated suffering, a consciousness born of decades of violence, fear, and death. "It uses the prison itself," he explained, voice low, "as a medium. It can manipulate space, objects, even time, feeding on fear and despair. And Halloween amplifies its strength." The team split to cover more ground, but the shadows were waiting. One corridor led an investigator to a room he swore had been empty. Inside was a cell with a figure slumped on the floor. Approaching cautiously, he realized it was Marcus, or rather, a distorted, spectral version of him, eyes wide with terror, muttering unintelligible words. The figure raised a trembling hand toward him and disappeared before contact, leaving only a cold whisper. "It sees you too." Objects continued moving with increasing aggression. Papers scattered, lights swung from their fixtures, and chains rattled without wind or contact. The investigators realized the entity had grown capable of direct interaction, shaping their environment to disorient, terrify, and isolate them. The very buildings seemed to breathe around them, corridors narrowing and expanding, ceilings lowering, shadows elongating. Every instinct screamed to leave, but Mindel pressed forward, understanding that the deeper they went, the closer they might come to Marcus, and perhaps the truth. By the final hours of the night, they discovered a hidden chamber, long forgotten in prison blueprints. Inside, the walls were covered with faded inscriptions, old chains, and remnants of previous Halloween incidents. The energy was suffocating. Whispers surrounded them from every corner. As they examined the chamber, a flickering light revealed an outline. A tall, dark figure standing perfectly still, watching. Its presence was suffocating, yet it did not move. Cameras caught the moment, showing the figure stretch impossibly, bending around corners, before vanishing entirely. Detective Mindel felt it in her chest, a mix of fear and revelation. The entity was not simply malicious. It was intelligent, patient, and methodical. It had been observing, learning, and perhaps even guiding events for decades. Marcus Tillman had not simply escaped. He had become part of a much larger, incomprehensible plan. The entity was preparing them, testing them, and revealing the terrifying truth. The prison was a conduit, a trap, and the shadows were only the beginning. By dawn, the surviving investigators regrouped, shaken and exhausted. Their footage was chaotic but undeniable. They had interacted with something beyond understanding, and Marcus's fate was still unresolved. The prison remained alive around them, whispering promises and threats simultaneously. The night of Halloween had returned, darker and heavier than before. Detective Laura Mindel and the remaining team knew that tonight they would confront the entity that had haunted Dade Correctional for decades. Every shadow stretched unnaturally, every whisper seemed intentional, and the prison itself pulsed with an unseen awareness. Marcus Tillman's fate was no longer just a mystery, it was a warning. They retraced the path Marcus had taken, moving cautiously through the northern wing where the prison's oldest horrors were concentrated. Chains rattled, doors creaked, and distant whispers formed unintelligible phrases that seemed to mimic the investigators' thoughts. Cameras and thermal sensors picked up fleeting glimpses of Marcus, or something wearing his face, moving between spaces that shouldn't exist. At last, they entered the hidden chamber uncovered the previous night. Symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly in the dim light, resonating with the dark energy in the room. The tall, distorted figure appeared, stretching impossibly, bending around corners, its presence suffocating. Mindel raised her voice, calling Marcus's name, and the room seemed to respond. Shadows twisted and elongated, converging into a vortex of darkness. For a moment, a figure emerged from the blackness. Marcus, distorted and spectral, eyes wide with terror. He reached toward Mindel, whispering, "It's not just a shadow. It's the prison, and it wants more." Before she could respond, the entity surged forward, enveloping Marcus and the surrounding space in darkness. Light flickered, and when the glow returned, Marcus was gone. The inscriptions on the walls had shifted. New symbols appeared, marking the night's events and the investigators themselves. The team fled, shaken and irrevocably changed. Cameras captured fleeting glimpses of the tall figure trailing them through hallways that no longer obeyed normal geometry. The prison seemed alive, aware, and patient. It had claimed Marcus, tested the investigators, and left its mark. Mindel realized that Dade Correctional was no ordinary building. It was a conduit, a trap, and the entity would return again, stronger, hungrier, and always aware. As they exited the prison into the cold night, one last whisper followed them, barely audible over the wind. Halloween is never over, and some shadows never leave. The story of Marcus Tillman ended, or perhaps it had only begun. If you want to uncover more chilling truths and witness the shadows that lurk where few dare to look, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us before the darkness finds you.